to begin my talk with a confession, and so I want to make myself as comfortable as I possibly can. So I'll take my shoes off there for a moment. If you've ever been in my class, you know that's normal as well. But what is my confession? I'm currently suffering from an acute sense of skepticism when it comes to the overall meaning of innovation and its value. So much so that I have come to believe that innovation, as it's been popularly framed, is overrated and may even be dampening the human spirit. So that's your first aberration for the day. So let me explain a bit. So innovation, by definition, is disruptive. It's inherently impactful, and oftentimes it can be even awe-inspiring. And I'm going to assume most of us, if not all of us here today, would like our work and our lives to be more disruptive, albeit in a positive and productive way, more impactful, and perhaps even awe-inspiring. So we should all just simply go be more innovative, right? Well, of course, with all things that are this profound, it's not that complicated. In fact, it can be quite difficult. Indeed, it is one thing to want to be more innovative, and it is an entirely different thing to actually be more innovative. And unfortunately, many of us come to believe over time that it's out of our reach to live our most innovative life possible. And so it's really important to kind of think about what are the reasons for this. And oftentimes you can think in your own mind, I'm not creative enough, I'm not courageous enough, I'm not charismatic enough, I'm not clever enough. The list can go on and on and on. And it's really important to start to try to get to the root of how it is that we all became, or many of us anyhow, came to be so susceptible to adopting and internalizing these counterproductive beliefs, if you will. So one reason that I will argue for why it is that we come to believe such things is the way in which the meaning of innovation is introduced and reinforced to us through the popular media, our educational experiences certainly, our work lives, our consumption preferences. It could go on and on and on. Take, for example, Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is often pointed to as one of the quintessential innovators of modern times. And he was quoted as having said, "I want to leave my own ding on the universe." And it's like, wow, if you really think about that, he kind of did in his own way. And then you begin to think, someone who is able to act successfully on such profound ambition must be one of those proverbial unicorns, right? And as I look out over the audience today, it's a very attractive audience, admittedly, but I see nobody with a single horn kind of protruding out of your forehead. Indeed, rest assured, there are no unicorns here. And there are no unicorns anywhere else either. So just as we have to work to demystify the notion of the proverbial unicorn, we should work to demystify the popularized notion of innovation as well. So in order to start to do that, let's think a little bit about popular phrases that we often hear. The most innovative this, the most innovative that. These types of phrases now permeate the branding strategies of any organization, it seems, that wants to claim to having greater relevancy to today's fast-paced, tech-driven economy and society. So much so that it seems as though we're bombarded with messages that intersect our lives in a number of profound ways. So the homes we live in, the clothes we wear, the foods we eat, the medical treatments we need and seek, the schools we and our children attend, it goes on and on. Indeed, sometimes it seems as though it's hard to discern whether we're consuming innovation or is innovation consuming us. Now, of course, admittedly, innovation has always been at the center of human progress. The Roman aqueducts, medieval elephant clocks, the assembly line, these are just a few of the myriad of innovations that have pushed us forward over time, albeit not always in just and sustainable ways. But nonetheless, today, our urgent pursuit of innovation has reached a point of hyper-fanaticism, obsession, really. So if we want to try to understand this obsession a bit more, let's turn to a moment to superstar innovators of today, or the type of folks that one of my close and brilliant colleagues here at the University of Arizona, Hope Scow, recently referred to as exceptional others. The Bezos, Gates, Jobs, and Musks of the world, these larger-than-life figures who enjoy celebrity status based on having some kind of mythical genius and mystical vision. I don't, for one moment, begin to doubt or take away from the immense success that these figures have had, their ambition. It's amazing. However, I do refuse to believe that those successes and talents can be ultimately traced back to a very, very rare innovation gene that is actually so rare that we haven't even discovered it yet, right? But somehow we fall into this mindset. And unfortunately, what that does over time, this notion of exceptional otherism, is it leads us to believe that we are not capable of being as innovative. We are not capable of being the leaders of change that we want to do, or want to be. So ultimately, what we end up doing is we dismiss, we discount, or altogether overlook and refuse to accept our own abilities to be innovative. And that, I argue, is a shame and something that we shouldn't be satisfied with. Now, of course, I also don't want to, however, somehow think that the message is naive and that there aren't these extraordinary talents that have pushed us forward over time. Who am I, for example, to minimize the unmet brilliance of Leonardo da Vinci or the fearless intelligence of a Madame Curie? I don't, and I wouldn't. But again, I refuse to accept this idea that our own capacity to live our most innovative life somehow comes down to some innate talent that is genetically predetermined. There is, however, some reality that is underpinning this popularized notion of innovation that I've been talking about, and that reality links to wealth and prestige. So there's a biblical parable in the book of Matthew that depicts a tendency of cumulative advantage. And if you're not familiar with that, you might begin to recognize it when you hear things such as the rich get richer or wealth begets wealth. And it turns out that this same tendency can be extended and complicated by laying over an element of innovation. So then you begin to get things such as wealth begets innovation, and innovation begets wealth, or the innovative get wealthy, and the wealthier get more innovative. So you can begin to kind of see this circular dynamic. But just to further and more firmly illustrate the point, let's take this popularized notion of innovation and intersect it with the most elite and prestigious sector of higher education. This is going to be very timely, considering the news that has broken this week. I did not plan it this way. Okay, Stanford University. That's where we're going, Silicon Valley. So in 2012, a report by Easley and Miller indicated that Stanford alumni alone were responsible for developing over 8,000 firms globally that together generated more than $1.27 trillion of wealth. $1.27 trillion, by my estimation, is not pocket change. And if it is pocket change by your estimation, I would be delighted to talk to you after the talk today, and I'll even put my shoes back on for that conversation. But nonetheless, what do we know about Stanford University? Well, indeed, Stanford University is an exceptional place. It is undoubtedly one of the most elite and innovative universities, not only in the United States, but the world. And here comes the relevancy. It is also really, really hard to access. So each year, there's somewhere around only 4 to 5 to 6% of undergraduate student applicants are actually admitted. So it is really difficult. You have to be in the 94th to 95th percentile to gain entrance. And going back to this tendency of cumulative advantage, what we also know by numerous studies is that students that possess the most competitive academic profiles, whether real or not, actually come from privileged backgrounds. Shocker, I know, right? And they, by having those privileged backgrounds, have access to relatively high cultural, economic, and social capital, like, for example, first-generation college students like myself, and I know many students that are out there as well, don't have. So this cumulative advantage begins to build up, and it can transcend in all different ways of our life, including our capacity to be innovative. By the way, where is Stanford University located? Palo Alto, California, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley. What do we know about Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley is one of, if not the premier destinations for innovation in the world. So the question becomes, if we want to live our most innovative life, do we have to try to penetrate the barriers of a Stanford University or similar university environments? Do we have to somehow make the sacrifice to plant ourselves in an environment such as the Silicon Valley? And of course, I'm going to argue, no, absolutely not. But yet, this popularized notion of innovation leads us to believe so. This is not a dynamic of empowerment, but this is rather one of wealth and prestige that continues to perpetuate this notion of popularized innovation and continue to lead us down the road of thinking somehow being the most innovative leader of change, if you will, is out of our reach. Now, I do want to be very, very clear that I am not trying to devalue the many contributions that come out of innovative and elite environments like a Stanford University, or I'm not trying to minimize the contributions that are made by those few exceptional others that I mentioned earlier. However, what I adamantly want to do is begin a conversation and a movement where we work to replace this popularized notion of innovation and begin to replace it with one that's more accessible, one that's more democratic, and one that's more viable for all of us, regardless of what our backgrounds are. So in this regard, what I want us to do is step out of this shadow of exclusivity and begin to embrace the power and the potential of every day. Now, here's the golden lining in all of this, is that responding to this call to action can and should be relatively easy. How? No, I am not going to say simply be more innovative. Close, though. I am going to say that we should work much harder with greater attention and focus on being more ingenious at the scale of every day. So let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean by describing 4 basic traits of everyday ingenuity. This is experimentation, agility, resourcefulness, and sense-making. Okay, and in order to do this, I'm going to draw on observations that I've made over the past 5 years or so, studying the entrepreneurial lives of small-scale farmers, local food entrepreneurs, and most recently, craft brewers. This is a tough gig, but somebody has to do it, so it ought to be me, I argue. First, experimentation. So what do I mean by experimentation? This is the consistent testing and refining of new ideas, accepting the reality that failure is a necessary step toward progress. So when I think about experimentation, I'm reminded of a local craft brewer who has ruined batch after batch after batch of beer in pursuit of the perfect representation of the unique beauty that surrounds us in the Sonoran Desert. And I know it's a tragic story. You're like, don't waste the beer. But actually, it turns out to be a pretty positive and uplifting story because he's come up with what I believe to be one of the most perfect recipes for using just the right amount of dried desert blooms to create a seasonal beer that with every sip you're met with the aroma of the monsoon. And for those of us that spend time in the desert, that's a really special thing to us. So it's pretty amazing. Second is agility. And agility is the ability to learn and grow and pivot from the various challenges and opportunities, big or small, that we inherently encounter every day of our lives if we just pay attention. So when I think of agility, I think of an urban farmer in New Mexico who is constantly changing and tweaking his business model in order to better support his unwavering commitment to transforming his community from a food desert into a food oasis, and just an amazing journey that he's had, and he's having real impact right in his neighborhood. We don't ever hear about him as if he was a unicorn, but his work is amazing, and we can learn from that. Very accessible to us. Next is resourcefulness, and resourcefulness, this is the ability to see and leverage and maximize the value of everything that's put in front of you, regardless of how modest it is. We don't need the likes of a Stanford University to do what we need to do. We just need to be resourceful in my mind, or at least in part. So with resourcefulness, I think of the very clever rural farmer who she is constantly, with judicious discretion, identifying and inventorying and kind of collecting gadgets, materials, and tools that others are willing to discard. And she's not collecting and identifying those and holding on to them because she has an immediate need, but she's keenly aware that her margins are very slim and that at some point there is going to be a problem that she needs to overcome. And now she suddenly has what was once discarded becomes capital to her. And that's a really wise thing. When I think about resourcefulness, I also think about a saying that my grandfather used to say. He was an auctioneer, and he would always say, not just to me, but to all of my cousins and my brother, is we'd always want to throw out all the stuff that was dirty and didn't seem all that valuable. And he would always say, Matthew, there is no such thing as junk. It's all merchandise to somebody. And in the context of everyday ingenuity, there is no such thing as junk. It's just capital waiting to be repurposed and revalued if we could just be attentive to it. That's a really powerful element to being ingenious under our own terms. Lastly is sense-making. And this is the ability to develop new meaning and clarity of intent to our work by paying attention to the wisdom that can be gained and gleaned through everyday activities and interactions. And when I think of sense-making, I think of another brewer who, by paying very close attention to why it is her customers develop such firm and long-standing commitment and loyalty to her and her brewery, came to determine that it really had nothing to do with her beer at all, no matter how good it was. But it was more about how she produced the beer using sustainable water-conscious practices without being willing to sacrifice that for other gains. And so this was a very powerful insight for her and a revelation, where now she sees herself, she brands herself as not a brewer first, but a conservationist first, with beer happening to be her tool. And I think that's a very powerful transformation as well that can open up crazy new doors for people, right? You just have to be attentive to how to do that because you control those terms. Now, you may be sitting there, and I know I heard on the video coming in was, this is a little bit about skepticism. So you may have a little bit of skepticism yourself saying, these are really no-brainer things. And I would absolutely agree with you. These 4 traits that I just laid out with you are no-brainers, and that's really the point. These are beautifully simple, yet potentially powerful steps that we can all take each and every day throughout our routines and our lives in order to, recall the beginning of the talk, to be more disruptive in a positive and productive way, be more impactful, and absolutely be awe-inspiring to those that we care to reach the most. So with that said, I would like to encourage us to go be more ingenious on the scale of every day, because we not only owe it to ourselves, but we owe it to those we aim to serve. So thank you.